Hello, everyone, and welcome to the first session of our course. The course title is Beyond Jerusalem, Exploring the History of Churches of Christ in Central Europe. I am Spencer Davidson. I'll be the facilitator for this class, and I welcome you from wherever you're joining in the world. And the important thing about this class is whenever you are joining in this world. The way we have shifted some things here at Harbinger Institute is important because typically you have a set time in class where you show up, you participate in class in a certain kind of way, and then you leave class almost as if you were physically present. This term, the majority of our classes have shifted to what we call an asynchronous learning model. This means that you can join by video, watching a video lecture, and get the course material, hear a lecture, and then in your own time, watch that video and work to respond to it. And we're providing ample time and space consideration to students because we have fortunately grown over the last several terms to include students, more students from across many different time zones. So it's not possible for everyone, nor is it practical for everyone to join in one single class at one single time at one single point in the week. So we have to broaden everyone's window. The benefit is that this allows students with various levels of access to the internet, data bundles, to study in a way where they don't feel as though they have to be rushed. They have to get it all in one moment. This allows people to go at their own pace, and I like that. So we're making efforts here at Harbinger to accommodate people and make learning what it should be. Today, we're going to be introducing and getting into the content a little bit of this great course that we have planned. It's something that I've been looking forward to for quite some time, and I appreciate all of you expressing your interest and being so attentive already to some of the things that we're going to be looking at. So I'm going to be working off of a PowerPoint, and if you've had a class with me before, you'll know that immediately this is a little different than what we normally look at. Typically, the PowerPoints that I show have a lot of material on them. They're almost, you could say, busy. I've tried to scale that back because I want the PowerPoint to simply be a marker of the topic or the heading that we are under. And of course, we'll provide some quotes, but the key here is to use as little data as possible. So hopefully by not having to, again, absorb so many resources, learning can be facilitated and made accessible to more people in a variety of different contexts. And I don't have a final number yet, but I know that there are numerous countries represented in this course and throughout many of the courses that we're offering this term. So I'm quite pleased to see that. Now, this course, Beyond Jerusalem, I'm so pleased that you've expressed interest in this course. This is, I think, a quite important course. It will be, I hope, thought-provoking, inspiring, and something that you'll want to tell your friends and coworkers about. Over the next 6 weeks, we're going to be exploring a part of history that doesn't frequently get a lot of attention. And if you're not very familiar with history, if you're not someone that gets excited about history or thinks that history matters very much, I hope this will change your mind a little bit. I hope you'll be encouraged to read more. And that sort of brings us to the first major point I'd like for us to discuss. What kind of course is this? I think it's important that I begin by saying this is not a history course. It is not intended to be the kind of course that would be presented if an academically trained historian taught it, because I am not an academically trained historian, nor do I publish work about history, nor is history one of my principal areas of interest. So when you approach this course, I hope you'll do so with the understanding that we're not going to be looking at this from a proper historical vantage. So it sounds as though I've maybe presented something to you that maybe I'm giving you something else. Pause. This is a course that will give precisely what I've maybe presented it to be, and that is we're going to go beyond Jerusalem. We're going to explore the history of churches of Christ in Central Europe using a text. And that's something that I hope you'll see immediately that does represent this course. We're going to be examining a book with virtually the same title, and I'll provide you a digital copy of this book. The book is a thrilling read, and there are plenty of things about the book that we can pick apart, that we can critically reflect on. Now, this is getting more into my territory. We can come to the text, which is history and tradition of churches of Christ in Central Europe by Hans Godwin Grimm. That's our text. We can look at this, do some critical reading, and take that for what it is. But that doesn't quite fully meet what I see this course as being and what I hope you'll expect it to be, because it's not just a critical reading of a text. Because in a proper critical reading of a text, there are certain things you do and certain things you don't do. I'm going to transgress some of those that I wouldn't normally transgress, making it not a historical reflection or a critical reading of a piece of academic literature. So what is it? It's a little bit of both of those, executed to varying degrees. But it is also, this course, a devotional presentation. It's something that I've not ever done with Harbinger, in that we're going to be looking at this text in the context of letting it invoke our faith in the Church of Christ. Now, everything, if you've had a class with me before, you know it all is about faith. We talk about faith extensively. We talk about developing faith a lot. The last course I taught was a section on the beauty of the cross and the Bible in the contemporary world. These things all relate to faith, but I want you to understand that this course is going to rely more heavily on faith and hope to work as sort of a devotional than perhaps others would. So all I'm wanting to do is foreground the road ahead with a bit of messaging about what you should expect. So I don't want anyone to go away from this thinking I've tried to provide any one single version, a historical reading, an investigation, a critical reading, of an academic text, or plainly something that you would get out of a Bible class at church. It's neither one of those three, but it's a little bit of each of them. So with that in mind, I'll begin where our author does, and we'll talk more about him later. He as an individual is not all that important. I'll begin with Matthew 16:18. What is important? We're concerned with the history of the churches of Christ in Central Europe. We want to go from their origin point to beyond that origin point. But before we do that, we have to see this statement, this all-important statement that, as we'll see, comes front and center in our text. It should be a verse that's quite familiar to all of us. There, Jesus speaking with his disciples come to Caesarea Philippi. Jesus says to Peter, after Peter makes that confession, "You are the Christ, the Son of the living God," he says, "You are Peter, and on this rock I will build my church, and the gates of hell shall not prevail against it." This is so rich in meaning and so provocative because there are so many different interpretations of it. What I will tell you is that for us, and by us, I'm speaking to members of the Church of Christ, members of, however you think of it now, a religious group with a certain name, a certain history, certain beliefs, certain trajectory. This text should be all important, just as it is to many other religious groups. However, we should hold fast to what Jesus promises. He says, "I will build." When we investigate that word translated build, we see in the Greek that it is composed in a manner that first and foremost tells us of its certainty. The grammar of this word provides clarity as to whether or not Jesus will in fact go through with this. Jesus says, without question, "I'm building it." I'm building it. By build, what do we mean build? That's something that we'll see in the coming moments later in this course. But we can be assured that build means what we think it means. Build means to construct, whether we see it visibly or invisibly across history. Jesus says, "I'm going to be putting something together. And that which I'm putting together," he says, "belongs to me." It is what I'm doing exclusively, and it is something that I have ownership of. It's so important because as we trace the church throughout history, we find that ownership, authority come up again and again and again and again. And I think it's quite important for us to be fair. What we don't see throughout history, even amongst some of the most impassioned and even misguided at times religious discourse, we don't find people saying, "This is anyone else's church but Jesus's church." Oftentimes, we degrade people, thinking that because people use a certain name to identify their religious group, that they're suggesting that that church, they believe that church belongs to anyone other than Jesus. We have to be fair. I don't find, except with maybe a few extreme cases, that people actually think that's what they're organizing under, that they're going to someone else's church than Jesus's. What we do see, though, is while that is what the belief is, practically, maybe so, it doesn't work out that way. Nevertheless, Jesus says in the original moment that his church will be built and it will belong to him. Meaning, it's ultimately something that he possesses and has authority in. And because of this, he can ensure that it will never fade. It will never be disposed of. It will not be conquered. But the tone of this is not just that the church will be on the defense, rather, it will be on the offensive. It will be moving forward, not merely holding ground. It will be advancing, so much so that the very gates of hell, the mouth of death, the fortress of doom, is not going to prevail against it. This final piece of this text is so critical for our discussion today because, as members of the Church of Christ, we have this sense that at some point in history, the Church of Christ originated. It came forth and existed on the earth. We point to the New Testament for this, specifically the book of Acts, to show that the Church of Christ appears. However, the common story is that after some time, it goes away. Why does it go away? Well, the claim is that people stopped believing, people stopped practicing, people stopped gathering, and it goes and disappears. Only until sometime the 18th, 19th centuries, it begins to show up again. Somehow, people return to the scriptures, and the Church of Christ exists in the world once more. Oddly enough, in America, in the United States, and now the church has been restored. It seems like that would stand in contradiction to what we have in the text here. If we have a portrait of a church built with certainty, owned with certainty, and perpetual for certain, why do we hold fast to this claim that it disappeared, that someone extinguished it, that it went away? Why? I want this course to challenge that belief. I want this course to stand in the face of that claim that the church had to be restored because it went away. What I'm not claiming is that the church at certain places in certain times will always need to be restored because it's fallen out of form. But people oftentimes confuse that with it needing to be brought back again from non-existence everywhere. And I'm afraid, I'll say it just plainly, that Americans are to blame for this. We think we're the first ones to say everything, to do everything, to make everything. It's not always the case. We've made great advancements. We've done amazing things in this world, but we did not invent the Church of Christ. The Church of Christ did not appear again for the first time after over 1,000 years on our shores. This course, I hope, will encourage you to know that it has done exactly what Jesus said that it would do. It has not fallen to the forces of hell. The Church of Christ has existed in the world ever since it originated in Acts chapter 2, and it has a history, most of which we'll never know, most of which was never even written down. But just because of these things doesn't mean it didn't happen. We have to be careful not to think of history too much as a science here. Science meaning something that you can place into a laboratory and confirm and configure every single one of its parts, that you can boil it down to these key things, that you can rely so much on a text. Without that text, we can't know for certain. That may be fine with other things. The history of Toyota, the history of basketball. But when it comes to the Church of Christ, we're talking about something all completely different. We're talking about the history of people. We're talking about the history of faith. These things, in their true nature, can rarely be written down. So we have to be careful when we say, if it's not written down, it didn't happen. If we can't see it, it's not there. We will go with the text that illuminates portions of our history from beyond Europe, or rather beyond Jerusalem, to Central Europe. Now, before we ask this key question, I want us to just, for the sake of everyone's benefit, I want us to see this in scope. I'd like everybody to be on the same page. And what I'm going to do is pull up a map so we can see the scope of the area that we're describing here. So here we are with Google Maps. I hope you can see. And this is our beautiful world. We're going to zoom in now and look at the area where the Church of Christ originates. It says the Bible lands, as we call them. Now, you might say, Spencer, we're running into a problem right off the bat, because when you say Church of Christ, you haven't defined it. You're speaking with a little bit of a presupposition. I feel empowered to do so based on the text we just read. I'm referring to that very thing which Jesus just said will for certain come into existence and will for certain not leave existence. That's what I'm referring to. And by the scriptures, I claim it did in fact come into existence and did so in this place. I refer to it as the Church of Christ in the sense that it belongs to Christ. So that is the organization, the entity that I am referring to. And I claim it begins right here, because that's what the scriptures tell us. This is the Bible lands, and this is the city of Jerusalem. This is where it all started. And we could take a whole 6 weeks talking about the activity of the Church of Christ in this area. But we know it expanded beyond this area. We know it winds up all throughout the ancient world. There's no contention there. It moves all over Alexandria, Egypt, Damascus, Syria, Antioch. It goes beyond those original borders. It travels up north to Turkey and Greece. These are the areas of Paul's missionary journey. Paul plans to sail past Malta, even over here to Spain at one point. He plans it, but we know for sure he's in Rome. The Bible records the history of the Lord's church as something that goes quite far if you think of it. This is a lot of movement here from Jerusalem all throughout this region. But what we're saying is that it did, in fact, go out. And we can have a good degree of certainty about some of the things that happened. What we're going to claim is that it went beyond Jerusalem into this region of Central Europe. And I'm going to say it's not just Central Europe. It actually includes a good bit of North Africa. In the first chapter, there are references to places in Tunisia, Algeria, Libya, I believe. So we can't just say Central Europe because the text actually goes a little bit outside of Europe as well. But for the majority of the book, we're talking about northern Greece. We're talking about parts of Italy, lots in France, the British Isles, into what is today Germany and Austria, Romania, Serbia, Bulgaria, Croatia, etc. These areas. So have we gone beyond Jerusalem? Certainly. How do we know this? Well, because today we are in America, we're in Canada, we're in Latin America. We're all over the world. Some of you are attending this class from the Philippines, from India, Pakistan. And we should be sure to see Africa. Our African students are from Kenya, Uganda. We have in Chad, Nigeria, all over is my point. So it's no stretch to say that the church at one time extended from Jerusalem over to Central Europe, because we know the church can move in this dynamic way, because it already has. We're living it today. So one of the major questions about this movement, about the very nature of the church, is, should the church be identifiable throughout history? There's a lot of agreement that the church did everything that I've claimed that it's done. That is to say, that it appears, spreads, and remains. These are not highly controversial claims. But what is controversial, to some extent, is whether or not people can see the church. What do we mean by see the church? Well, is it visible in certain aspects, meaning buildings, ceremonies, etc., or is it invisible? Is it something that is purely mystical, only known to God? Is it invisible in that we can't ever be sure this is the church, but we're taking an educated guess that it's the church, or we're moving by faith that it's the church? That seems to be the general thought. The church is either visible or invisible. It's either very much something that we can point to and say that's it, or it's something that we can't be sure. Or we could say it's only really known to God. Now, That's a deep oversimplification because the conversation is actually quite spread between the two. But I'm giving you the example of maybe the two extremes. And I don't know if you've ever really thought about this, but for our purposes today, it's crucial. If we're going to explore the history of the churches of Christ, we have to understand where the Church of Christ stands in terms of its visibility, which means its traceability, which means its standing among a group of people, and the records that were produced about it, or its invisibility, where we say, well, we will never know, or we'll never really see it, but we believe by faith that it's there. Let's look at a few thoughts on this. Of course, thinking on this subject of the visibility of the church differs amongst various churches. We have a Catholic statement here, and remember, this is a Catholic statement, just as I will show a Protestant statement and a Orthodox statement. These are not the statements, meaning the only ones and final ones to exist. These are just three that I have pulled as examples. So this is a Catholic statement. The one Church of Christ, which in the creed is professed as one holy Catholic and apostolic, which our Savior, after his resurrection, commissioned Peter to shepherd, and him and the other apostles to extend and direct with authority, which he erected for all ages as the pillar and mainstay of the truth. This church, constituted and organized in the world as a society, subsists in the Catholic Church, which is governed by the successor of Peter and by the bishops in communion with him. This picture is one of a very visible church. One that has, we see here, certain visible actors, priestly roles, one that society is big here, one that consists of a recognized order, and one that persists in the world at all times. So the Catholic view of this is that the church is highly visible and must be highly visible. That's what I want to point out. And that actually the visibility of the church, let me back up, that the reality of the church is in the visibility of the church. So we have here a dependence on visibility. That's what we see predominantly in the Catholic view, that in order for us to know the church is real and there, it must be visible, because visibility is essential to the church. Now, the Protestant view is a bit different. It's not an extreme difference. That's what I want us to see, baby. There's not as many extremes in religious dialogue as there are some nuances. The Protestant view, and again, a Protestant view, one comes from John Calvin. He says, yet as it is now our purpose to discuss the visible church, let us learn, even from the simple title, Mother, how useful indeed, how necessary the knowledge of her is, since there is no other means of entering into life unless she conceive us in the womb and give us birth. Unless she nourish us at her breasts, however, in this church there is a very large mixture of hypocrites who have nothing of Christ but the name and outward appearance. So the picture here is one that critiques the first, one that says you may have a visible church in thinking. Of course, that's good to think about. But what really happens? What usually happens, the Protestant reformers suggest, is that the institution exists, but the interior life of people, the conduct, The real Christianity is rarely there. So is it the church? What makes the church the church? Is it the walls and the ceremony, the pews or the roof? Or is it the people and their beliefs, their conduct, the way they behave? How do you know where the church is? Perhaps it's more than just walking by a building and saying, there it is. I think that's a very valid critique, just as I think it's very valid that the church must be in existence and it can never go away, as the first view suggests. Now, of course, there is a third position, and again, this is a view of that position. We call it the position from orthodoxy. This comes from Sergei Bulgakov from his book, The Orthodox Church. He says the church is above nature. In other words, it exists apart from the world, still it is included within the life of the world. These two attributes are equally characteristic. From the viewpoint of the former, we say the church is invisible, different from all that is visible in the world, from all that is the object of perception among the things in the world. If the church were really invisible, completely imperceptible, that would mean simply that there were no church, for the church cannot exist solely in itself apart from mankind. He goes on to say, it all surpasses the limits of the visible world, but still the invisible may become visible, and in fact, that we might see the invisible in the very condition of the existence of the church. One of the great merits of the Orthodox theological tradition is its ability to hone in on the spiritual presence of all variety of things we find in Scripture, and I'll say, sort of defeating the modern hesitations that have built up because of our, again, overly scientific worldview. We say it must either be visible or it must be invisible. But this view says, well, it has to be one or the other. In fact, it has to be both, but it can't be both. It's quite confusing, but again, if we stay on this passage, we understand that there is a lot of merit to this, and that in fact, it doesn't at all set aside one view or the other, but it simply says the church must be visible and it must be invisible, but it can't be only visible or only invisible. The church does something that we see played out in the New Testament, where the invisible becomes visible, such as in the incarnation of Jesus Christ, as in the Holy Spirit coming to the Christian in baptism and then being made visible through the actions of the Christian, the fruit of the Spirit. The church is just one more instance of this, and we shouldn't, again, try to make a science of it. It is more of a mystical thing, and that's a lot of what you'll find in this theological tradition. And there's, of course, many merits to that. One of the things that I would like for us to consider in the middle of this question of visible or invisible, I want to simply ask, visible to whom? It seems for just a general number of discussions on this topic, we never strike at the heart of the question of who is supposed to be seeing this church. I think if we unpack that, if we consider the vantage point of the observer, we'll soon realize that you cannot over contextualize the church, meaning that you cannot say the Church of Christ in America is the Church of Christ, or the Church of Christ in one place or another, that is the church. All I'm saying is that our knowledge of the church does not define the church. And by knowledge, I simply mean where we can point to it existing. Because at this very moment in time, in every place where students are of this class, there's a congregation of the Church of Christ in your area that you don't know about. I would say with a high degree of certainty that you've experienced this once or twice in your life, where you've been somewhere locally and discovered there's a congregation here. I didn't know about them. Maybe some others did. Maybe some others didn't. I claim that they're still Christians. They're still a part of the body of Christ. And it didn't require us knowing about them for them to be who they are. Now, when we broaden this out globally, I'm quite sure that the Church of Christ exists in countries where we don't think it does. I'm quite sure that over the history of the world, over 2,000 years, the Church of Christ has experienced things, has achieved things, has gone into places, has suffered things we'll never know about. But it does not mean it didn't happen. It does not mean it's not Christian history. It just means we don't know. It just means we haven't seen. It just means we haven't read. It just means it wasn't written down. This is all important pre-knowledge in order for us to approach our text. Because the book that we'll be looking at over the course of this course makes this claim that churches of Christ have existed in the world unseen by so many, nevertheless, they've existed. And this is some of the things that have happened to them. And so we present this information to defeat the claim that the Church of Christ existed in Jerusalem, vanished from the world, and then reappeared in America. Or to say it's an American church, it's an Indian church, it's an African church. No, it's Christ's church. One of the things that helps us to sort of settle into that position is this great parable we have from Matthew 13, the parable of the wheat and the tares. Well, without going into too much analysis, let's read the parable. The kingdom of heaven may be compared to a man who sowed good seed in his field. But while his men were sleeping, the enemy came and sowed weeds among the wheat and went away. So when the plants came up and he bore again, then the weeds also appeared. And the servants of the master of the house came and said to him, Master, did you not sow good seed in your field? How then does it have weeds? He said to them, An enemy has done this. So the servants said to him, Then do you want us to go and gather them? But he said, No, lest in the gathering the weeds you root up the wheat along with them. Let both grow together until the harvest. And at the harvest time, I will tell the reapers, gather the weeds first and bind them in bundles to be burned, but gather the wheat into my barn. I think what's really critical for us to see in this passage right now is the fact that we, as the servants of God, have a place setting where there will be those who are visibly wheat and those who are visibly weeds, tares. However, even if we can clearly distinguish them, they are clearly visible to us. It is not our job to remove them from this earth. It's important that we call, and there is no, the master has no problem saying, these are weeds. He never denies that. And we should expose weeds for what they are. But notice, it's the reaper's jobs, not the servants, to gather those weeds up. It's the job of the angels to gather up both, to sort them out, either into fire or into the barn. But nevertheless, they're discernible. But we live among them. They live among us. They're visible in this world, but we have a responsibility, a certain level of responsibility to act in a matter of humility, care, and also expectation. So I place this here simply to say we have a scriptural basis for thinking that the church can be visible. We also have a scriptural basis to understand that some things happen invisibly. All of this happened while men slept. And while men sleep, just as bad things can happen, good things can happen. How many nights passed where the wheat safely grew? Men were sleeping, but God was awake. I claim that our text takes place on those nights. We can logically conclude those nights exist by the way this parable is written. So therefore, let's with confidence, based on the portrait the scripture provides, move towards our text. That the church of Christ, like this good wheat, safely grew, lived, worshiped, trusted over the course of history without the gaze of history being fully upon it. Specifically, the gaze of history that seems to be the only valid one, which is the American view. It's just not the case. Let's think beyond that, beyond Jerusalem as well. Okay, I've already pulled out the map, but I was going to show the growth and so forth. But we've seen that. I'll say a few words about our author, and then I'll invite you to read the first 17 pages of the book that we'll look at. In fact, let me do this. I'm going to pull it up on my screen so that we can all have just a moment to look at it. I'll share this all with you. It should open right up, but if you have any issues, let me know. And there are a few versions of this out there available. This is the one that I find has least amount of trouble opening up for people. And I'll share it with you all, of course. But this is the book that I'd like for us to look at. It is Tradition and History of the Early Churches of Christ in Central Europe. Our author is quite a intriguing person. And we'll see for a moment some things about him. So our author is Hans Godwin Grimm, and we can see that he is born in Switzerland, and he was the son of one of the final elders in his area. What we'll learn is that his grandfather and perhaps even his great-grandfather were elders as well. His claim is that he comes from a long line of Christians in this region, and that over the course of his life, he learned of the history of the church, but this history was never written down, so he wants to write it down. So he goes and becomes educated in university and begins writing his text on the history of the churches of Christ in Central Europe. As he is proceeding to do this, World War II erupts, and he is eventually thrown into a concentration camp, a prisoner camp. We learn that his library and manuscript of the book were confiscated, and shortly after, 10 years later, a second manuscript is produced. He starts writing it all over again, produces another, organizes another library. It's destroyed. So now multiple efforts have been made to write this book. At this point, it's just about surviving. He does survive. And you can clearly see this is not this is almost like a pamphlet. I understand this. He escapes to Berlin in December of 1952. And until 1955, he was a lecturer in Kassel. Now, it is at this time he makes contact with brethren in America, and he arrives in America. The final portion of this is him coming to see that the faith he grew up with as a boy in Central Europe, there in Switzerland, is actually now alive and well in America. And it's very inspiring to read his account of this. During this period, once he comes to America and can enjoy the safety and the security there, I think he primarily works in Texas. He writes this, about 70 pages of what his original book was going to be. And it's not without citation to historical text. He actually has a bibliography here that it functions better than some, not as great as we would hope for. But this is the product of a man who had been through a war, who was approaching the end of his life, whose life work had been foiled multiple times. He just wanted to leave something behind. And so while you could judge this so harshly, while you could critique it to the point of exhaustion, I say let's take it for what it is. And let's, with our own discernment, spiritual, scholarly, otherwise, approach this text and glean from it something worth holding on to. So I will share this with you all. I invite you to read the first 17 pages. We'll have More discussion of it in our next session. But this will conclude our introduction. I thank you for your attention. I thank you for your interest. I hope this has not stifled that interest. I hope it's only built it up. If you have any questions, any needs, any comments, please let me know. I'm available by email, and I'll look forward to hearing from you. God bless you. Thank you.